Our next speaker today is Dr. David Nicholson, and he's a postdoctoral fellow at Emory University working in the laboratory of asteroid prints. And his talk is titled, Neural Network Models of Object Recognition Can Also Account for Visual Search Behavior.
Thanks, Elaine. Let me go ahead and share. Are you all seeing that okay?
Yep.
Cool, thank you. Not that. Let me click on the right button. Okay. Right, so I'm gonna tell you about some work we've done in the Prince lab using neural network models of object recognition to account for visual search behavior. And when I say visual search, you might be thinking of some behavior out in the real world where you're seeing natural scenes and you're trying to answer some question like, is there a person there? And you have all these context clues like there's a bench, so I look there, I won't look in the sky because I don't expect people to be in the sky. So we know people perform this task really efficiently using a lot of this contextual information, but still there are limits on our ability to perform that task. And for a long time, people have asked, like, if I examine what factors limit performance, does that tell me how the brain solves this task? And as Thomas has just done a great job of showing and helping me introduce this because we have zero time to provide nuance, people have historically used these really simplified stimuli to investigate visual search in lab tasks. And there's a lot of good reasons to do this if you want to ask questions about, like, does occlusion matter? If you want to ask these really controlled questions. And so I don't have time to get into the nuance of these stimuli or the results obtained with them or the models that are based on those results. But the main issue that we want to address is that the way that the prevailing models are specified assumes that the inputs will be some discrete set of items where those items are described by human-defined features like color, luminance, orientation. And it's just unclear how you would extend those dominant models to natural images where you can't just easily extract some description in terms of color, orientation, number of objects that's there. So that's one reason we want to use artificial neural network models, which are image computable. So you can give them any image and get some answer, which at least gives us a hope of reconciling results across all these different tasks that use different stimuli. And the other reason that we want to use artificial neural networks, we're motivated by a proposed computation untangling, which we think could account for visual search behavior across these different stimuli. So let me give you my attempt to define untangling in like 20 seconds. So this is proposed by people studying object recognition. If you think about the low-level features that your retina extracts, you have this high-dimensional, low-level feature space. And the sort of idea is that your ventral visual stream performs some series of nonlinear transformations such that you map this low-level feature space to some neural space, like inferior temporal cortex space, where your brain can find some separating hyperplane that lets you discriminate between two objects. And there's good reason, based on previous literature, to think that this might possibly account for visual search behavior. So I promise we didn't just pull this out of thin air, but again, I have zero time to touch on that actual literature. But let me just tell you what we've done. So we take these AND models of object recognition, hold all the parameters constant, except for the last layer, this sort of decoding output layer, which we train with something called transfer learning on these simplified stimuli that have historically been used. And when we do that, we see what are called set size effects. That's a technical term from the literature. So you see that as the number of targets and distractors increases, that's the set size, there's a decrease in accuracy. So you know, this is a hallmark effect in the literature. So if untangling can provide this effect, then that suggests that it could account for this behavior. In contrast, if we take the same models, but without pre-training them for image classification, which is what makes them object recognition models, instead we just train from scratch on randomly initialized weights, we see that they can, in some cases, find near perfect, they get near perfect accuracy. They can find some solution that lets them perform almost perfectly. Not always, but this is like an existence proof. There is a solution. They can find it if they're not pre-trained for object recognition. And this holds across various types of models. If you train them on a bunch of stimuli, it's not perfect, but this is like a proof of concept that untangling could account for set size effects seen in these experiments. But there's more work to do. This is just the beginning of a story. But more what we care about is what I alluded to in the beginning. We want to account for effects across these different stimuli types. So to get at that, we took this visual search difficulty data set, which assigns difficulty scores to images from Pascal VOC, which is like a benchmark image classification data set. And the scores are derived from human reaction times, people searching these images. So what we did is we performed the same transfer learning experiment where we just hold the parameters constant and then just train the last layer to do this task. And when we do that, we measure performance on the test set where we've binned the images by the difficulty score, and we measure the accuracy within that bin. And what you can see is we find this inverse correlation, whereas the difficulty score increases, the accuracy decreases. So again, this is just suggesting that this untangling could account for aspects of limitations on visual search performance. And one last thing really quick, what's nice about this data set is there's multiple targets labeled. We did multi-label classification, so we can ask for the same image, are multiple targets detected? This is not a solved problem in the same way that single label classification is. But for models that performed well on the test set, we can again see that there's this inverse correlation between difficulty score and accuracy. So based on those results, we think that so far, untangling does have the potential to account for these limitations on visual search performance across stimuli types. I'm on Twitter as Nickel Dave, so I'll tweet out these slides later if you want to replicate our findings in the safety of your own home while social distancing. I'll tweet out these links as well. And then Elaine asked to put up some discussion points. Thank you, Elaine, for preparing us. Maybe if I read the emails, then I do a better job of preparing myself. But I do have some points here to talk about, like, as I alluded to, if we're optimizing for object recognition, is that what limits our ability to perform visual search? Can think about this within this sort of deep learning framework for neuroscience, or you might argue that we just haven't figured out the right way to optimize our networks for visual search. You might talk about other aspects of visual search behavior that people measure, such as reaction times, and how we would account for those. And then you might point out that the last task I looked at is effectively the same as an object recognition task. So what does it mean that those tasks that we use in the lab are very similar, even though we're trying to get at what we think of as different behaviors out there in the real world? And then you might ask why I completely avoided using the term selective visual attention. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. Let the questioning begin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was really interesting.
Thanks.
So yeah,
could I ask a question?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So I think I missed exactly, and it's kind of on that last point that you said of like the task at the end seemed very similar to just an object recognition task. And so I was unclear just literally on how you were going from like a VGG or some deep network to doing a search task. Like what exactly, how did you make that linking?
Right. So in the case of the first task with the simplified stimuli, there's two output units. So it can either say target present or target absent. So it's classifying the image as target present or target absent. In the case of the Pascal VOC dataset, I'm really just doing image classification. So if it, and we trained it two ways. For single label classification, we tried doing either just train it to report the largest image, which you can do using the bounding box, the largest object, or we tried using just some random object during training time. And then you can just go back and ask which ones does it report as is present. And if you only look at the images which have only a single label, which is like a majority of the data set, then you can get the accuracy for just those images. Or you can do the multi-label classification, which I won't nerd out too much about the details, but then you can ask like which ones does it report as present.
So, and I guess more broadly, like, what is the difference between visual search and object recognition or object detection? Like, I'm not familiar with like visual search literature that well. Like, is there, yeah, how are they the same? How are they different? Or is part of the point of your work, they're kind of very similar in some way? Like, I don't know. Like, if you could talk on that, I'd be curious.
Yeah, I mean, my take right now from the literature is that the way these tasks are performed in the lab, they are effectively the same, right? So especially in the case that I'm able to address with the current models where you can ask about accuracy. So the motivations are different. The people that measure accuracy when they're doing a visual search task, they, just like people that are looking at object recognition, it's a time limited setting. So I show you the stimulus for like 100 milliseconds. The reason to do that for people studying object recognition, there's a host of reasons, but the way that they've operationalized object recognition, they want to look at first some number of seconds of neural activity, and they want to, and they know that performance is effectively as good as it's going to get within those first 100 milliseconds. For people studying visual search, there's a question of like, do I want to allow eye movements? And one way to control for that is just show the image for 100 milliseconds. So again, make it time limited, but in that case, you don't have reaction time, depending on how you do the task. So if you just measure accuracy in this time limited setting, you end up sort of by accident with the same task, but you're saying that it's visual search. But this is sort of where there's this mixing of the task and what it is you're trying to get at, right? If you're trying to get at visual search, if you're using visual search to try to understand attention, then maybe you think that all you need to do is this time limited setting where you don't move your eyes.
Okay, we have a great question here from Katharina Ducker.
Right, I see, yeah. Can untangling account for serial and parallel properties of search? Yeah. And then she also asks, assuming I've heard neural networks can only classify one object at a time, which would make me think untangling would mainly reflect serial search. It's a really good question. And I'm trying to give a clear answer. So these neural network models are feed forward. They're okay, yeah. So a little bit of background really quick. There's sort of two competing models based on these simple stimuli. There's a serial model, which argues that limitations arise from some serial processing step like binding the features together into an item. Then there's a separate family of models, which are usually specified in terms of signal detection theory that argue that the limitations are from parallel noisy processing. So a neural network's massively parallel, but it's not noisy, right? It's deterministic. If I show it an image and I don't change that image, I always get the same answer, unless I have it still in training mode and I have something like dropout that makes it behave stochastically. So I can't get an answer if that's my model about whether it's parallel noisy effects. I also can't really ask a question about serial processing because there's no explicit representation of time in these models. So there's different ways you can get at this. So as Elaine will know, because she's working on this, right? You could use like a diffusion drift mechanism to try to get at this. So people have done this, adding this diffusion drift type mechanism to these parallel noisy models to sort of pit it directly against the serial models. So you could do something like that with an AND model, an artificial neural network, and try to sort of pit these two parallel versus serial models against each other that way. And anyone else who knows more about this than me, please feel free to jump in and correct me.
That was great. So there's just one other quick question that looks like it might be quick. Do you train the network for search task on each object you are searching for? Okay.
Right. So in the first case with the simplified stimuli, the training set is all 10 stimuli types at the same time. And we do see, like, basically as you increase the number of types, there is sort of an effect there, which we don't expect to be the case for human search. So that's one sort of place where you could say that there's a caveat here. But and the same is true for the with natural images, right? We're training on the whole data set all at once. So
okay. Okay, great. I guess we'll move on then.